Welcome to another episode of The Dissection. Let's cut right into this topic. Will President Cyril Ramaphosa reshuffle the cabinet after this budget fiasco is over? It's a logical question, and it's one that's worth thinking about at this particular point. Over the last 3 months, we've really witnessed the deterioration of the government of national unity, or more correctly named, the Grand Coalition formed post the 2024 elections in South Africa. Think about what's been happening in the last 3 months. On the 23rd of January, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa signed the Expropriation Act and all hell broke loose in the Democratic Alliance, at AfriForum, and at Solidarity. You know, on TikTok, there's a popular sound. Rainfall in Durban. Cyril Ramaphosa, you're getting on my last nerves, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, you're getting on my last nerves. That is the mood that was happening within the Democratic Alliance. I know Helen Zille has that sound as her ringtone. She definitely has that sound as a ringtone. I'm just kidding. She probably doesn't. But that was the mood. That was the mood. Rainfall in Durban. Cyril Ramaphosa, you're getting on my last nerves. That's exactly how John Steenhuisen, Helen Zille, and Kali Kriel and all of these guys felt about the signing of the Expropriation Act. It was for them a crossing of the red line. And they then sat down and really began to think, how are we going to respond to this? Trips to America, all manner of things started happening. But within the parliamentary process, the response that we saw from the Democratic Alliance, their political answer on the chessboard of political moves within Parliament was that they withdrew support for the original budget, or they started to create roadblocks for the original budget, right? That was the move that they chose to make. The budget speech got delayed weeks after the signing of the Expropriation Act. It was meant to be on the 19th of February. The DA said, we're not going to vote for that thing, Chief. Going to embarrass you in front of the world. And it was rescheduled to the 12th of March. Even after the 12th of March, the DA said, we're not coming to this party. You can forget about us. And it got, eventually, the fiscal framework got adopted on the 2nd of April, right? And it didn't have the support of the Democratic Alliance. Parliament voted to adopt the fiscal framework on the 22nd and the 23rd of April. The Western Cape High Court was hearing arguments from the DA and the EFF are against how this was done and against the powers of the minister in the VAT Act to determine the VAT rate. This has all happened within 3 months. Think about it. Think about what 23rd of January, Mr. Ramaphosa is signing the Expropriation Act. 23rd of April, the VAT Act is now in court. Who's taken it to court? The Democratic Alliance. This is a deterioration. This is a serious deterioration in the quality of relationship between the two major parties within this coalition, which begs the question, is it going to last? Is there going to be a cabinet reshuffle on the 24th of April, right? One day after the last day of the arguments in the Western Cape High Court, the ANC and the other parties who voted for the fiscal framework held a press conference, and absent were the Democratic Alliance and the Freedom Front Plus. That absence was glaring. The writing is seemingly on the wall. The acrimony has gotten to a point where there's not a conversation about how long this will last. It's clear that this thing is not lasting. There's now a conversation about whether there will be a reshuffling of the cabinet and when the removal of the DA from the coalition will happen. The formation of GNU 2.0 is seemingly on the table in a real way right now, based on the events of the last few days. John Steenhuisen, the leader of the Democratic Alliance, was asked about a cabinet reshuffle yesterday by Sophie Mokoena from the SABC, and his answer was very interesting. Listen to what John had to say when he was asked. Listen to this exchange. It's an interesting exchange.
However, I would say that if there were moves to remove the DA from the GNU, I think that given the current geopolitical environment, that it would be a mistake.
Not removal of the DA, but bringing in those parties in government. And secondly, remember, it's the prerogative of the president to appoint and release ministers.
Of course, but remember the government is formed on the basis of the statement of intent.
No, but the constitution is the guiding document in terms of how the country should be handled, be led, or how you run the government. The president has got the prerogative, according to the Constitution, to appoint or to relieve ministers. The statement of intent, it's a political agreement. It's neither an act of parliament nor a constitutional obligation with separation of powers. I'm sure you understand that.
Yes, of course. But remember, the president himself was elected on the basis of the statement of intent. So
the appointment of the president and the election of the president, it was done in parliament, an independent arm of state, and there was agreement to elect him. He's now the head of state. The Constitution says the president has a prerogative to appoint or to relieve the ministers.
But the statement of intent is also very clear.
But the statement of intent, it's not an act.
Yeah, but it's a coalition agreement. It's the coalition agreement.
The statement of intent, it's not an act of parliament.
Yes, but if the statement of intent is torn up, then you don't have a GNU. And then we're released from any obligation in motions of no confidence, in whatever happens before Parliament. We'll be released from those obligations. And I think that you will also know that the statement of intent talks about proportionality in the cabinet seats. Where are the cabinet seats that are going to be given to other people going to come from? Are you going to take from other parties and give away? Is the ANC going to give up some of their seats? Remember, all of these things are a delicate negotiation, just like any coalition in the world. In Germany, Japan, many of the other countries, it's based on the coalition agreement. The German government fell over a fallout in the budget. The Japanese government is negotiating around a budget. But all of these essentially at the end of the day come back to the agreement between the parties. You can't just simply tear up the statement of intent. It is the very basis and foundation. And the president's actions would have to be determined of that. Of course, he appoints and disappoints ministers, but this is not the unfettered and unconstrained position that you had when your party had a majority. The ANC is now a 39% party, and they have to govern with others. And that governing arrangement is done on the basis of the statement of intent.
Well, let me tell you what this sounded like to me, listening to John Steenhuisen very carefully. It sounded to me like John Steenhuisen was making two threats, a principal argument and a legal argument, but he was making some threats. And I don't know if you picked up those threats. Let me break it down, and you'll see what I'm talking about. First, he said that removing the Democratic Alliance would be a mistake because of the geopolitical environment. Removing the Democratic Alliance would be a mistake because of the geopolitical environment. What you mean by that, Mr. Steenhuisen? What you mean by that? I'm going to break down what he means by that. He can only be making reference to Donald Trump and the USA. The threat, because Mr. Ramaphosa has good relationships with Europe, he has good relationships with China, so he's only talking about you-know-who when he's talking about this. The threat is that removing the Democratic Alliance is something that would not be appreciated by the current U.S. administration. And you need to know, the Democratic Alliance has traveled to the USA this year, and they do lobby in the USA. They spend money in America to reach out to members of Congress, and I think they're reaching out more to the Republicans than anybody else. Because what is the Democratic Alliance leader trying to say here? Is he trying to say that they're a right-wing party, that they are aligned with the Republican Party? I mean, what do they have in common with the Republican Party or Mr. Trump at this particular point, which would change the geopolitical dynamics? Can you get what he's trying to imply? Is he trying to imply that the USA will impose sanctions on the ANC leaders or South Africa if the DA is removed from the GNU? What has he been told? Why is that the first thing that comes out of his mouth in response to this? Well, the geopolitical environment. Yeah. If you listen carefully, you hear. Right? And if you hear, you hear. Did you hear? The threat. The second threat was that the DA will not protect Mr. Ramaphosa from votes of no confidence. Right? This is something that is in reference to the Phala scandal and some of the other scandals which have recently arisen which affect Mr. Ramaphosa's ministers. Think about these two ministers, for example. Khumbudzo Ntshavheni has been accused of giving a tender to a company that did not even bid for a tender when she was a municipal manager in Phalaborwa. And Thembisi Melane is facing multiple allegations, including taking money from the middlemen of VBS to deposit municipal funds in the VBS bank when she was mayor of Polokwane. Right? These things may not seem to be things that can bring down a president at face value, scandals affecting your ministers. But I want to tell you about a man called Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson, he was throwing parties at his residence 10 Downing Street during the COVID pandemic, and that really created a scandal, but it didn't remove him from office. He ultimately fell as a result of a scandal implicating one of his key supporters. Let me tell you about the fall of Boris Johnson as an interesting case study in what the DA is seemingly talking about here. In July of 2022, a scandal broke out, which didn't directly affect Boris Johnson in the UK. Scandal broke out, but it toppled Boris Johnson. So there's this gentleman known as Chris Pincher. The Chris Pincher gentleman led to a scandal. His conduct led to a scandal. Chris Pincher was the deputy chief whip of the Tory party, and he was, and I think he still is, a Boris Johnson loyalist. This gentleman, Chris Pincher, got drunk in a pub, and he started molesting other men. He was grabbing their nyash. You know nyash? He was grabbing the nyashes of other men there in the club. That's their bum for those who are uninitiated to, that type of discourse. So he was drunk and he was doing all of this molestation and poorly behaving. It later emerged that his misconduct was long-standing and known within the party. His actual nickname was Pincher by name and Pincher by nature. Remember, his name is Chris Pincher. Pincher by name and Pincher by nature. That's what they'd say about this man when he was walking around. And there goes Pincher by name and Pincher by nature. Not naughty by nature, Pincher by nature. Because he was pinching nyash everywhere he goes. If he gets drunk, pinches nyash. Right? Then the question arose if Boris Johnson knew this when he appointed him. Did the Prime Minister know? The government initially denied that at the time of Pincher's appointment as the Deputy Chief Whip, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson had any knowledge of any specific complaints about Pincher of a similar nature. But devastatingly, Boris Johnson later had to admit that this was not the case, that he knew. And then this raised questions about his earlier denials and why Johnson nevertheless had chosen to appoint Chris Pincher as the Deputy Chief Whip. Boris Johnson obviously valued having a loyalist who could pay attention to what Boris Sunak and others were doing and make sure that he was protected. That's why he appointed that dude, because he was loyal to him. But he was Chris Pincher, the pincher of Nyash. So that scandal sparked a major crisis for Boris Johnson's government, and his ministers, government staff, started resigning. Between the 5th and the 7th of July, a lot of ministers resigned. And on the 7th of July, Boris Johnson announced that he would then resign as the party leader. He fell. That's how he fell. Not the COVID parties, but something that was done by his deputy chief whip. So the veiled threat from the Democratic Alliance is that they're going to fold their arms when the time comes and Mr. Ramaphosa faces a challenge from within the ANC. Or if a scandal breaks out that leads to his leadership being questioned one way or another, they're going to say, as the London Mandem say, allow it, fam. Allow it. Innit? Allow it. That's what they're going to do. They say, you can remove us from this cabinet here, but we don't want something to happen to you. The mafia, they call that an offer you can refuse, right? So basically, that's what they're trying to do. That's what they're trying to argue. Let's talk about now the legal argument that is being made by John Steenhuisen. The Democratic Alliance believes it has a basis to be angry and a basis to take the actions it has taken on the grounds of the statement of intent. You heard John Steenhuisen, but the statement of intent, because the Constitution gives the powers to appoint the cabinet to the president. They're his powers, it's his prerogative. But they're saying, but the statement of intent. So this document matters, and to them, particularly the modalities section, which relates to the composition of cabinet, disputes, and budgets. What does that document actually say? That statement of intent in the modalities section, right? So Section 14 going down there deals with the modalities of the government of national unity. Section 14 says the following. Parties will work together in good faith and seek to build consensus on the formation of the government where no party has an outright majority on the basis of the above shared values and minimum program and in the interest of all South Africa's people. Section 15. Parties will cooperate with each other in respect of the executive and or legislature activities to advance these shared goals. Section 16. The government of national unity shall be constituted in a manner that reflects the genuine inclusiveness of political parties that are party to the statement of intent and are represented in the National Assembly, broadly taking into account the number of seats parties have in the National Assembly and the need to advance the national interest. The President shall, in constituting the executive, take into account the electoral outcomes. Section 17. Whilst recognizing the President's prerogative to appoint members of the executive, such appointments should be done in consultation with the leaders of the respective parties of the members considered for appointment. You see it? So they're saying you can't just appoint the cabinet or you disappoint the cabinet without talking to us. We have a deal. We have an agreement. Section 18, the government shall take decisions in accordance with the established practice of consensus. Where no consensus is possible, the principle of sufficient consensus shall apply. Then you get into the big debate about sufficient consensus, which is dealt with in Section 19. Sufficient consensus exists when 19.1, all parties have had the opportunity to express their views. 19.2, despite reasonable attempts to resolve disagreements and find common ground, there is no general consensus. 19.3, parties to the GNU representing 60% of the seats in the National Assembly agree. You see that one? Sufficient consensus exists when 19.3, parties to the GNU representing 60% of seats in the National Assembly agree. ANC's got 40, they've got 22. So they're like, well, it has to be you and us. We have to agree. If we don't agree, you can't make that particular decision, right? You can't make it if there's no sufficient consensus. Any party that disagrees has been able to formally record their objections. 19.4. Section 20. The parties to the GNU shall also establish dispute resolution or deadlock breaking mechanisms in instances where sufficient consensus is not reached. Parties should raise disputes within the mechanisms created for this purpose. That's the clearinghouse mechanism thing that Paul Mashatile is in charge of. Then Section 21. The parties recognized established government and cabinet protocols in decision-making and the formulation of the budget. So the DA is like, when you read the document, you know these guys are not meeting the terms and conditions. The T's and C's apply, but they're not being applied. That's what they're saying. The argument by the DA is that they have an agreement, a contract, and the ANC is in breach of that contract. Effectively, that's what they're saying. But, and whenever you hear the word but, as they say, this legal argument really holds no water, because if you make the argument based on some kind of principles of contract law, then the question then comes, is this a valid contract? Is it an enforceable contract? Right? Let's look into that. What is the definition of a contract? Contracts are agreements between parties who have the intention to create legal rights and duties between them and which are legally binding upon the parties. Not all agreements are contracts. A contract is legally binding because the parties intended to create legal rights and duties between them. This intention is called animus contrahendi in law. Contracts create legal obligations between persons or legal subjects. A legal obligation is a legal tie or relationship between two parties, which means that one party has a duty to give a certain performance, while the other party has a corresponding right to receive the performance. Every obligation, therefore, involves one right and one duty for a particular performance. A performance requires a party to conduct itself in a specific way. The performance can either be to do something, to give something, or to refrain from doing something. So the DA is arguing we have clear, performances that are necessary in the appointment of cabinet, in the reshuffling of cabinet, you have to talk to us. You have to talk to us about the budget. You have to talk to us and reach sufficient consensus. That's what they're arguing. Now, in law, there are certain requirements for a valid contract. In order for that contract to be valid, these are the requirements that must be met. Number one, there must be agreement. The parties must have reached agreement on the terms of the contract, the parties to the contract, and finally, both must intend to create a legally binding contract. There must be animus contrahendi. Number two, there must be contractual capacity. The parties must have the necessary legal capacity to enter into a contract. They must have the ability to understand the nature and effect of the contract and to act in accordance with that understanding. Number three, there must be certainty. The terms of the contract must be sufficiently certain. Number four, there must be possibility. At the time of the conclusion of the contract, it must be objectively possible to perform in terms of the contract, meaning certain things need to be in alignment with all of the laws. People need to be able to correspond and make sure that they can perform those particular duties and obligations. Number five, formalities. As a general rule, a contract can take any form, can be oral, in writing, or even tacit. However, formalities may be prescribed by statute or by the parties themselves. And then legality. An agreement cannot be contrary to a common law, rule, or public policy, constitution, whatever. Further, if an agreement is contrary to a statute, it will be invalid if that is the intention of the legislation. So all of the requirements that I've just outlined, the six, must be met for a contract to be valid. Agreement, contractual capacity, certainty, possibility, formalities, legality. Even if only one requirement has not been met, the contract would be invalid. So is a statement of intent a valid contract? Is it even a contract? Realistically and comprehensively, a statement of intent is not even a contract. It is what is known as pacta di contrahendo. It's an agreement to make a contract in the future. What is pacta di contrahendo? What is this Latin that I'm mispronouncing most likely, right? It's an agreement to make a contract in the future. It's a preliminary agreement that envisages the conclusion of the main contract in the future. In other words, there are always two contracts involved. First, there is the envisaged main contract, which could be a contract of sale, lease, donation, etc. Second, there is this preliminary contract, the pacta di contrahendo, which facilitates the formation of the main contract. But what you need to be aware of is that in general, these types of contracts are not enforceable in South African law. Two exceptions do exist: option contracts and contracts of preference. This is not what the statement of intent is. So it's not a binding contract. It's not a legal document. It's a political document. It's a document that you can argue politically for. You can try to convince voters that you have been wronged, that the terms have been wrong, that the deal has not been upheld. But to over-rely on it as if it is not merely just an agreement with no legal standing is where I think the DA overplays their hand. But I want to make it clear. In principle, I think the Democratic Alliance is correct. There was a political agreement between them and the ANC. They wrote that agreement down. They signed it. Helen Zille signed it. Fikile Mbalula signed it. But in terms of enforceability of that agreement, they have no cards. There's no court that can rule in their favor because they don't have a real contract. But the ANC has been acting in ways that go against what was agreed upon in the document between Helen Zille and Fikile Mbalula. But you see, Helen Zille, as the leader of the party, the Democratic Alliance, they are chair of the federal executive, she needed to be signing an agreement with maybe Gwede Mantashe, maybe an agreement with Cyril himself. Then it would have been something where we can really say that even at a political level, there was an agreement, because Fikile Mbalula is acting on behalf of the party, yes, and the SG is effectively the CEO of the organization, but he's not the president, and he's not the one who's going to be really leading the organization and leading and making some of the decisions, right? So in and of itself, it's not clear there was a meeting of the minds if President Ramaphosa really intended for all of these things to be done in the way that the DA and Helen Zille envisioned them, right? So how does this get fixed down the road? How does this get fixed? This question here of what is the status and enforceability of coalition agreements? What is required clearly is legislation that will regulate coalitions and coalition agreements in future, because right now there's no such legislation. The question then becomes, will the current National Assembly draft that legislation? I don't think so in this current formulation. It could happen if the DA is removed from the coalition and then they work together with the Umkhonto weSizwe Party and the Economic Freedom Fighters to really try to introduce legislation that will govern coalitions. But as we all know, they have sworn that they'll never do that. They view MK and EFF as doomsday parties. So they won't do it with doomsday parties. So then the question then becomes, even if a member bill is introduced, then where will it get support? The ANC is not likely to support any legislation that will weaken their leverage in future. This formulation of the coalition and how they came to create this GNU works quite well for them as it is, because then they can play the game that they are currently playing, where they'll say, well, we'll make a deal with you, but if you don't like your behavior, we'll go and find other partners, right? So they're not going to change that. They say, oh, listen, if we're staying 35%, 39%, 40%, this kind of a game works well for us, right? So these agreements don't have any legal authority, but they could be morally compelling, politically compelling, because you made a deal. You honor the deal. That's what honorable people do. You shake hands, do what you said, honor your commitments, keep your promises. So is a cabinet reshuffle likely at this point? In spite of everything that John Steenhuisen said and argued, I think that it is, but not immediately. I think that we've seen the anger, the frustration from various members of the ANC, listening to various members of the cabinet within the GNU. You could hear that people are using words such as extortion, that they're trying to frame the DA as being an entity that is outside of the GNU. And even the way that the meeting of the ANC and the other political parties suggested that the party's over, basically. The GNU honeymoon and the GNU marriage in and of itself is over. Now it's in that phase of the marriage where the couple is not even talking, they're not intimate, nothing is happening. The couple is the husband of the relationship is out there. We are Jola 99, right? Outside. That's what's happening, right? I actually think the way this will play out is that Mr. Ramaphosa will wait for the dust to settle and to see if he can actually strengthen his relationship with the Americans before making a domestic move like a cabinet reshuffle. That's what I think will happen. They'll wait for this VAT thing to play out, see how it plays out, see what the courts say, etc. Then once the budget has been passed, however it gets passed, then I think there may be a cabinet reshuffle. He'll probably invite other parties to join the GNU in the name of building more consensus, including more voices. They may very well do that. And then at some stage, there'll be a cabinet reshuffle. And he's going to try to work on this relationship with the Americans, because I think the DA has every intention of complaining to the Americans, which is why John Steenhuisen was talking about the geopolitical situation. And he's obviously aware of that. Now, in terms of, does he think that he's got enough support within the ANC to get to conference? He may very well think that he does, and that he'll take his chances at conference, and that big business may support him because maybe they're afraid of Poma Shatile and Panyaza, etc. And that, in fact, he'll be able to stay within the game, and that Fikile Mbalula as SG will be able to, deliver a victory for him. That could be a calculation he's making. So even if the DA says we're going to withdraw our support, they may think, well, withdraw it. We still have 201 votes in the National Assembly. Doesn't matter. With or without you, we can govern. And that could be the calculation. But we're definitely now in some uncharted waters. We are now in a situation where the conversation about the end of GNU version 1, I think, is a realistic one. and the conversation about cabinet reshuffle as well is a realistic one. Otherwise, Sophie Mokoena wouldn't have asked those questions. She really wouldn't have. I think the fact that she's asking those questions, she's such a senior journalist that you have to also take that into account. She's not asking just out of curiosity. She's asking because she's done her journalistic due diligence and has found out that, hey, this is on the cards, and is trying to get a response on the record for what the DA is thinking and what they're saying about this. And she asked John directly. Good questions, good pushback, good follow-up. Sophie Mokoena is one of the legends in journalism, and she's done a lot of good work. And I think she asked the right question, but I don't think she just asked it out of the blue. Something is happening. Something is cooking. We'll see. Time will tell. Thanks for watching. Let's meet in the comments. Let's have a conversation.